The water had gone cold hours ago, but she kept scrubbing. The tallow candle on the windowsill flickered twice, casting long shadows across the stone floor of the wash-house. Outside, Whitechapel slept its uneasy sleep, the autumn fog of 1888 pressing against the glass like something alive, something waiting. Her name was Sarah, though it hardly mattered now. What mattered was the bundle that had arrived before dawn, wrapped in brown paper and tied with butcher's twine. She had known, even before she opened it, what manner of garment lay within. The smell told her first. Copper and something else. Something deeper. The scent of violence that no amount of lie could ever fully chase away. The petticoat had belonged to a woman named Annie. Annie Chapman, they would call her in the morning papers, though Sarah had known her only as Dark Annie, a woman who sometimes brought her own washing when she had coin enough. Now Annie lay in the cold room of the Whitechapel mortuary, and her petticoat lay here, in water that had turned the colour of rust. Sarah's hands were raw. Her knuckles bled into the basin. And somewhere beyond the wash-house walls, somewhere in the fog and the filth and the labyrinth of alleyways, he was still out there, the one they had not yet learned to call the Ripper. She scrubbed harder. The stain would not lift. Chapter 1. The wash-house at the edge of the abyss. Good evening, and welcome. The night has grown quiet now, the world beyond your window settling into stillness. Wherever you are listening from, whatever hour the clock has struck, let the weight of the day fall away. You are safe here. If this is your first time joining the Bedside Historian, consider subscribing, for there are many more whispered journeys through the shadowed corridors of the past yet to come. And if you find yourself drifting peacefully into these forgotten histories, a like, a share, a small gesture of kindness helps this channel grow, helps these stories reach other weary travellers seeking rest. Now then, let us leave the present behind. Let us travel backward through the fog of years to a place where gaslight flickered against cobblestones and the Thames ran black beneath a smoke-choked sky. Let us go to Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888 and meet the women whose hands would touch what no one else dared to touch. The East End of London in that year was a world unto itself, a city within a city, though those who dwelt in the grand houses of the West End preferred not to acknowledge its existence. It sprawled eastward from the ancient walls of the city, a maze of narrow courts and cramped lodging houses, of gin palaces and chandlers' shops, of slaughterhouses and tanneries and match factories where children worked until their jaws rotted from the phosphorus. The air hung thick with a mingled scents of horse dung and coal smoke, of boiling hops from the breweries and the ever-present stench of the open sewers that ran between the tenements. More than 1 million souls lived in this cramped territory, packed into rooms where entire families slept in shifts, where the rent of 4p a night bought a share of a bed still warm from its previous occupant. Among these souls, largely unnoticed and entirely essential, laboured the laundresses. They were everywhere in Whitechapel, these women of the washtub, though a gentleman passing through might never see them. They worked in the back rooms of lodging houses and in the cramped basements of tenement buildings. They worked in small commercial washhouses that advertised their services with hand-painted signs, and they worked in their own kitchens, taking in bundles of soiled linen to supplement whatever meagre income their husbands or fathers might provide. Some worked alone. Others laboured in groups of 6 or 8, sharing the cost of fuel and soap, dividing the endless work among hands already cracked and bleeding from the lie. The work began before dawn. It had to, for there was so much of it, and the light of day was precious when one could not afford more than a stub of candle. The laundress would rise in darkness, often from a bed shared with children or sisters or fellow workers, and she would begin the laborious process of heating water. This alone could take an hour or more. The great copper pots had to be filled bucket by bucket from the communal pump in the courtyard, the water hauled upstairs or down into basements, the fire coaxed to life with whatever fuel could be scavenged or afforded. Coal was dear. Wood was scarce. Some women burned scraps of fabric too worn to be mended, or pages torn from old newspapers, anything that would produce enough heat to bring the water to a boil. Once the water was hot, the true labour commenced. The clothes had to be sorted first, the whites separated from the colours, the delicates set aside from the heavy woolens. Each type of fabric required different treatment, different temperatures, different soaps. The laundress learned these distinctions not from books, but from years of practice, from the wisdom passed down through generations of women who had spent their lives bent over steaming tubs. She learned which stains would lift with cold water and which required boiling. She learned to recognize the particular residue left by tallow candles, by coal dust, by the grease of cheap meat. She learned too the stains that would never fully come clean, no matter how long she scrubbed, no matter how much soap she wasted in the trying. The soap itself was a brutal thing. Commercial laundry soap in 1888 was made from animal fat and caustic soda, a combination that cleaned fabric effectively, but destroyed human skin with equal efficiency. The laundresses called it lye, and they feared it even as they depended upon it. Prolonged exposure turned hands red, then raw, then cracked and bleeding. The skin peeled away in strips. The nails grew soft and sometimes fell off entirely. Veteran washerwomen could be identified by their hands alone, by the permanent scarring, by the way their fingers had thickened and gnarled from years of immersion in the corrosive solution. They wrapped their hands in rags when they could afford to. Mostly they could not afford to. Mostly they simply endured. The physical toll extended far beyond the hands. The laundress spent her working hours bent over the washtub, scrubbing against a ribbed washboard that left permanent calluses across her knuckles. Her back ached from the constant stooping. Her shoulders burned from the repetitive motion. In winter, the steam from the hot water provided some relief from the cold, but it also filled the lungs with moisture that bred consumption and pneumonia. In summer, the washhouse became an inferno, the air so thick with humidity that breathing itself became a labour. Women fainted, women collapsed, women died sometimes, bent over their tubs, their hearts simply giving out from the strain of it all. For this work, a Whitechapel laundress might earn between 8 and 12 shillings per week, assuming she could secure enough customers to keep her tub filled. This was barely enough to survive. A single room in a lodging house cost 4 shillings weekly. Food consumed another 3 or 4. Soap and fuel for the washing took still more. What remained, if anything remained, went toward clothing, toward medicine when illness struck, toward the endless small expenses of simply existing in the most impoverished corner of the world's wealthiest city. Many laundresses supplemented their income through other means. Some took in mending. Some sold flowers or matches on the street corners when the washing was slow. Some, when desperation grew too great, walked the midnight streets and sold the only thing they had left to sell. The washhouses of Whitechapel served a clientele as varied as the district itself. There were the respectable poor, the factory workers and dock labourers who owned perhaps 2 shirts and needed one clean for Sunday church. There were the lodging housekeepers who sent their soiled bedding out by the bundle, sheet-stained with the sweat and sickness of 100 transient sleepers. There were the publicans who required clean aprons and tablecloths. There were the butchers whose garments came crusted with dried blood, the blood of cattle and pigs and sheep, a substance the laundresses knew intimately, a substance they had learned to remove through methods perfected over generations of practice. Blood was commonplace in Whitechapel. The slaughterhouses of Aldgate stood within walking distance, and the men who worked there brought their stained clothing to the local washerwomen as a matter of course. The laundresses thought nothing of plunging their hands into water turned crimson with animal blood. They knew its texture, its smell, the particular way it clung to wool as opposed to cotton. They knew that fresh blood washed out more easily than dried, that cold water worked better than hot for the initial rinse, that certain fabrics would never fully release the stain no matter what methods were employed. This knowledge was simply part of their trade, as unremarkable as a carpenter's familiarity with the grain of different woods. The autumn of 1888 began much as any other season in the East End. The summer heat faded into the chill of September, and the fog rolled in from the river. That particular London fog composed equally of mist and coal smoke, a yellowish shroud that muffled sound and obscured vision, and turned the gas lamps into pale ghosts of themselves. The laundresses noticed the change in the weather, primarily through its effect on their work. Clothes took longer to dry when the air was damp. The cold made the early morning trips to the pump more miserable. The fog crept into the washhouses and made the candles burn dimmer, so that the women had to strain their eyes to spot the stains they were meant to remove. They heard the rumours, of course. Everyone in Whitechapel heard the rumours. A woman had been found dead in Bucks Row on the last day of August. Her throat cut, her body violated in ways that the newspapers declined to describe in detail. Her name was Mary Ann Nichols, though most who knew her called her Polly. She had been 43 years old, a mother of 5, a woman who had struggled with drink and poverty, and had spent her final months moving between the common lodging houses of the East End, earning her DOS money however she could. The police had no suspects. The inquest revealed horrors that spread through the district in whispered conversations. Details too terrible for print, but too compelling to suppress. The laundresses listened to these whispers as they worked. They recognised some of the street names mentioned, some of the lodging houses. A few of them had known Polly Nichols by sight, had perhaps washed her clothes when she had coin enough to pay for clean linen. They crossed themselves and murmured prayers and returned to their scrubbing, for the work did not pause for tragedy. The work never paused. The bundles kept arriving, the water kept boiling, the soap kept eating away at their hands. Death was common in Whitechapel. Violent death was not unknown. A woman murdered in the street was horrible, certainly, but the East End had witnessed horrible things before. The laundresses assumed, as most residents assumed, that the killer would be caught or would simply disappear, that the murder would fade into the long catalogue of Whitechapel miseries, remembered only by those who had known the victim personally. They did not know, could not know, that this was only the beginning. In the first week of September, the fog grew thicker, the nights grew longer, and in the washhouses scattered throughout the district, the bundles of soiled clothing continued to arrive, carried by messenger boys and lodging-house servants, and sometimes by the owners themselves. The laundresses sorted them and scrubbed them and hung them to dry on lines strung across cramped courtyards. They complained of the cold and the damp and the price of coal. They gossiped about their neighbours and their customers and the incompetence of the Metropolitan Police. They went about their lives in the manner of women who had never known any life but this one, women for whom hardship was simply the texture of existence. The water steamed in the copper pots, the lye burned their hands, the candles guttered in the draughts that crept beneath the doors, and somewhere in the fog, moving through the same narrow streets where the laundresses walked to fetch their water, a darkness was gathering, a blade was being sharpened, a mind was turning toward thoughts that no sane person could comprehend. The women who washed the clothes of Whitechapel did not know that they would soon be washing something far more terrible than butchers' aprons and soiled bedsheets. They did not know that their hands would touch the final garments of women whose names would echo through history. They did not know that they were already standing at the edge of an abyss. They only knew that the work awaited them, as it always did, and that the morning would come too soon. The candles burned low, the fog pressed against the windows, and in the washhouses of Whitechapel the women scrubbed on, unaware that history was about to hand them its darkest laundry. Chapter 2. The First Bundle. The morning of the 31st of August broke grey and heavy over Whitechapel, the dawn struggling to penetrate the pall of smoke that hung perpetually above the rooftops. In the cramped basement wash-house behind a lodging establishment on Thomas Street, a woman named Martha Coley had already been awake for 2 hours. The fire beneath her copper pot had taken longer than usual to catch, the coal damp from the previous night's fog, and she had wasted precious minutes coaxing the reluctant flames to life. Now at last the water was heating, sending curls of steam into the chill air, and Martha sorted through the pile of laundry that awaited her attention. She was 47 years old, though she looked a decade older, her face lined and weathered by years of labour, her hair gone grey beneath the kerchief she wore to keep it from the steam. She had been a laundress for 32 years, having begun as a girl of 15 in her mother's washhouse in Spitalfields, and she had never known any other trade. Her hands bore the permanent marks of her profession, the skin thickened and scarred, the knuckles swollen, 2 fingernails missing entirely from an accident with a mangle some years past. She no longer noticed the pain when she plunged her hands into the lye. The nerves had long since surrendered. The bundle that had arrived before dawn sat apart from the others, wrapped in a piece of sacking and tied with a rough twine. The boy who had delivered it had said only that it came from the mortuary, that the police had finished with it, that it was to be cleaned and returned to the lodging house where its owner had last resided. Martha had not asked questions. She received bundles from the mortuary often enough that the occurrence no longer struck her as remarkable. People died in Whitechapel with depressing regularity. Their clothes had to go somewhere. She untied the twine and unwrapped the sacking, working by the light of a single tallow candle that sputtered on the shelf above her head. The garments within were those of a woman, poor but not destitute, the sort of clothing worn by thousands of women in the East End. A brown Ulster coat much mended, a brown linsey frock equally worn, 2 petticoats, 1 grey wool and 1 flannel, a pair of stays, stockings, a chemise. All of it stained, heavily and unmistakably with blood. Martha had washed blood from clothing more times than she could count. The slaughterhouse workers brought her their aprons and their shirts. The midwives brought her the linens from difficult births. Occasionally the police brought her garments from accident victims, from men crushed beneath carriage wheels or fallen from scaffolding. She knew the look of blood, the smell of it, the particular way it dried to a rust-brown stiffness in fabric. She knew, too, that blood told stories to those who knew how to read it. This blood told a story she did not wish to understand. It was concentrated in particular areas, around the collar of the dress, across the front of the bodice, saturating the petticoats in a pattern that spoke of wounds no accident could explain. The chemise was the worst, so thoroughly soaked that the original colour of the fabric was impossible to determine. Martha had seen blood from slaughtered cattle. She'd seen blood from women who'd hemorrhaged in childbirth. She'd never seen blood quite like this, blood that seemed to carry within it an echo of violence, of deliberate and terrible harm. She did not know, not yet, whose clothes these were. The newspapers would tell her later that day, when the evening editions arrived with their breathless accounts of the Bucks Row murder. She would learn that the garments had belonged to Mary Ann Nichols, called Polly, a woman of 43 who had been found in the early hours of that morning lying in a gateway off Bucks Row, with her throat cut so deeply that her head was nearly severed from her body. She would learn that the killer had done other things to her as well, things that the newspapers only hinted at, things that the coroner would describe in clinical detail at the inquest while the jurors turned pale and looked away. But Martha did not know these things yet. She knew only that she had a bundle of blooded clothing to wash, and that the work would not complete itself. She began, as she always did, with cold water. Hot water set bloodstains, fixing them permanently into the fibres of the fabric, a mistake that amateur washerwomen often made to their regret. Cold water loosened the blood, allowed it to release its grip on the cloth, permitted the laundress to work it free through patient scrubbing. Martha filled a basin from the pump in the courtyard, the pre-dawn darkness so complete that she had to feel her way along the familiar path, and she returned to her wash-house to begin the soaking. The water turned red almost immediately. She changed it, and it turned red again. She changed it a third time, a fourth, working through the garments one by one, watching the blood cloud into the basins and then drain away into the gutter that ran along the floor to the street outside. The copper pot had reached a boil by now, and the steam filled the small room, making the air heavy and difficult to breathe. Martha's chemise clung to her skin with moisture. Sweat ran down her face and mingled with the water that splashed up from her scrubbing. She thought, as she worked, about the woman who had worn these clothes. She did not know her name, but she knew her circumstances. The quality of the fabric told her that the woman had been poor. The careful mending told her that the woman had tried to maintain some dignity despite her poverty. The style of the garments told her that the woman had been middle-aged, past the years when fashion mattered, concerned only with warmth and modesty. And the blood, the terrible blood that would not stop seeping from the cloth no matter how many times she changed the water, told her that the woman had died badly. Other laundresses would have refused the work. Martha knew several who would not touch mortuary bundles under any circumstances, women who crossed themselves at the mention of death and believed that the garments of the dead carried misfortune with them. Martha had no such superstitions. She had washed the clothes of the dead for 30 years and had suffered no ill luck that she could attribute to the practice. Death was simply another form of dirt to be cleaned away, another stain to be removed, another task to be completed before the next bundle arrived. The dress proved the most difficult. The blood had soaked through multiple layers of fabric, penetrating from the bodice through the lining, and Martha had to work each layer separately, scrubbing against her washboard until her knuckles ached. The collar was worst of all, stiff with dried blood that had turned almost black in the hours since the woman's death. Martha knew what had caused that stain. The throat had been cut. The blood had poured out onto the collar and the bodice and the petticoats beneath, pooling and soaking and saturating, until no amount of washing would ever fully restore the fabric to its original state. She did her best. That was all she could do, all any laundress could do when faced with a task that exceeded the limits of her art. She scrubbed and soaked and scrubbed again. She applied soap liberally, working it into the fibres with her damaged fingers, ignoring the burning as the lye found the cracks in her skin. She boiled the chemise and the petticoats, watching the water turn pink and then red, and then a deep brownish crimson that made her stomach turn despite her years of experience. She wrung out the garments and examined them in the strengthening daylight, and found that the stains remained, faded but still visible, shadows of violence that no amount of labour could fully erase. By mid-morning, the work was done, or as done as it would ever be. Martha hung the garments on the line in the courtyard, where they swayed gently in the breeze like the ghosts of their former owner. The other laundresses in the neighbouring washhouses glanced at them curiously, noting the rust-brown discolorations that still marked the fabric, but none of them asked questions. Bloodied clothing was not unusual in Whitechapel. They assumed it had come from a slaughterhouse, or from a woman who had died in childbirth, or from some other mundane tragedy that did not concern them. The evening newspapers arrived that afternoon, and Martha learned the truth. The woman whose clothes she had washed was named Mary Ann Nichols. She had been murdered in Bucks Row, her throat cut, her body mutilated by a killer who had vanished into the fog before anyone could raise an alarm. The police had no suspects. The inquest was scheduled for the following day. All of Whitechapel was talking about it. The men in the public houses and the women at the water pumps, everyone asking the same questions that had no answers. Who had done this thing? Why? And would he do it again? Martha listened to the talk and said nothing. She did not mention that she had spent the morning washing the dead woman's clothes, that she had touched the fabric that had touched the wounds, that she had seen the pattern of the bloodstains and understood, in a way that no newspaper account could convey, exactly how much blood a human body could hold. She kept her knowledge to herself, as laundresses always did, for who would want to hear such things? Who would want to know that the brown dress hanging in her courtyard had been worn by a woman whose throat had been open to the spine? The clothes dried in the thin September sunlight. Martha took them down before evening and folded them carefully, wrapping them in clean paper for return to the lodging house. She received her payment, a few coins that would buy coal for tomorrow's washing and perhaps a bit of bread and dripping for her supper. Then she emptied her basins into the gutter and watched the last traces of Mary Ann Nichols swirl away into the darkness of the drain. She did not sleep well that night. She told herself it was the cold, or the sounds from the street outside, or the usual aches in her joints that always worsened when the weather turned damp. She did not admit even to herself that she kept seeing the bloodstains every time she closed her eyes, that she kept feeling the weight of the sodden fabric in her hands, that she kept smelling that particular copper scent that no amount of soap could fully disguise. She lay in her narrow bed and listened to the sounds of Whitechapel at night, the distant shouts from the public houses, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the occasional scream that might have been laughter or might have been something else entirely. Morning came eventually, as it always did. Martha rose in the darkness and began heating her water for another day of washing. New bundles had arrived overnight. The ordinary laundry of ordinary lives, sheets and shirts and stockings with no blood on them at all. She sorted them and scrubbed them and hung them to dry. And by midday she had almost convinced herself that the previous morning had been no different from any other. But her hands remembered. Her hands would always remember. And somewhere in Whitechapel, less than a week away, another woman was walking the midnight streets, unaware that her clothes would soon join the same terrible procession, that her garments would arrive at another wash-house wrapped in another piece of sacking, that another laundress would plunge her hands into water turned red with blood that should never have been spilled. The cycle was only beginning. The bundles would keep coming, and the women who washed them would carry the weight of that knowledge in their cracked and bleeding hands. Chapter 3. Dark Annie's Petticoat. 8 days passed between the murder of Mary Ann Nichols and the discovery of Annie Chapman's body in the backyard of 29 Hanbury Street. 8 days during which Whitechapel held its breath, during which the police questioned dozens of suspects and released them all, during which the newspapers published increasingly lurid speculation about the identity of the Bucks Row killer. 8 days during which the laundresses of the East End returned to their ordinary work, washing the ordinary clothes of ordinary people, trying to forget the bloodstains that had passed through their hands. Annie Chapman had been known in the lodging houses as Dark Annie, a name that referred to her complexion and her hair rather than her temperament. She had been 47 years old, nearly the same age as Martha Coley, though the two women had never met. She had been born Annie Eliza Smith, the daughter of a lifeguardsman, and she had married a coachman named John Chapman, who had given her 3 children before the drinking destroyed their union. Her husband had died 3 years before her own death, and the small allowance he had provided had died with him. Since then, Annie had survived through a combination of crochet work, flower selling, and the same desperate trade that sustained so many women in the East End when all other options had been exhausted. On the morning of the 8th of September, Annie Chapman was found lying in the yard behind a lodging house on Hanbury Street. Her throat had been cut. Her body had been mutilated in ways that the newspapers struggled to describe, and the coroner documented with clinical precision. Her possessions had been arranged at her feet in a peculiar pattern whose meaning no one could explain. She had been dead for perhaps 2 hours when the first witness stumbled upon her, the body already cold, the blood already drying on the ground beneath her. The laundress who received Annie Chapman's clothing was a woman named Elizabeth Stride. This was not the same Elizabeth Stride who would later become the third canonical victim of the killer, though the coincidence of names would trouble those who heard it. This Elizabeth Stride was a widow of 62 who operated a small washhouse in Brick Lane, a woman who had been taking in laundry since the reign of King William, and who had seen more blood pass through her basins than most surgeons had seen in their operating theatres. Elizabeth knew Annie Chapman, not well, not as a friend, but in the way that the working poor of Whitechapel knew each other, as faces glimpsed at the water pump, as figures passed in the narrow courts, as voices heard through the thin walls of the lodging houses. Annie had brought her washing to Elizabeth's establishment on 2 occasions that Elizabeth could recall, once in the spring and once in high summer, paying with coins that she counted out carefully from a worn leather purse. She had been quiet both times, polite but distant, her eyes carrying the hollow look of a woman who had seen too much hardship to expect anything better from life. Now Annie's clothes lay in Elizabeth's wash-house, delivered by a constable who had said nothing about where they came from, or how they had come to be so terribly stained. He had not needed to say anything. Everyone in Whitechapel knew about the Hanbury Street murder by the time the bundle arrived. Everyone knew whose clothes these were. Elizabeth considered refusing the work. She was not a superstitious woman, but she was a practical one, and she understood that washing the garments of a murdered woman would mark her in ways she might not welcome. The neighbours would talk. The other laundresses would whisper. Some customers might take their business elsewhere, unwilling to have their sheets and shirts cleaned in the same water that had touched such terrible things. It would have been the prudent choice to wrap the bundle up again and send it back to the police with a polite refusal. But Elizabeth Stride had never been a woman to refuse honest work. She had raised 4 children on the proceeds of her wash-house, had buried a husband and 2 of those children, had survived cholera and typhoid and the endless grinding poverty of the East End. She had washed the clothes of murder victims before, though never a victim quite like this one. She would wash them again, she knew, because death did not pause to consider the feelings of laundresses, and neither did the police who needed the evidence processed and returned. She began her work in the early afternoon, when the light from the single window was strongest. The garments had already been examined by the police surgeon and the detectives, had been photographed and catalogued and noted in official reports. Now they were simply dirty clothes waiting to be cleaned, though Elizabeth knew as she unwrapped them that there was nothing simple about them at all. Annie Chapman had been wearing a black figured jacket when she died, the fabric worn thin at the elbows and cuffs. Beneath it she had worn a brown bodice heavily mended, 2 petticoats, both wool, a pair of lace-up boots, a red and white striped stockings, all of it saturated with blood, the same deep brown red that Elizabeth had seen on slaughterhouse aprons, the same copper smell that she had learned to associate with death. The petticoats were the worst. Elizabeth lifted them from the bundle and felt the weight of them, heavy with dried blood that had soaked through layer after layer of fabric. The lower petticoat had been torn, a long rent in the fabric that corresponded to wounds described in the newspaper accounts of the inquest. Elizabeth did not want to think about what had caused that tear, what blade had passed through the fabric on its way to the flesh beneath. She tried to see only the cloth, only the stain, only the task that needed to be completed. She filled her largest basin with cold water and began the soaking. The blood released slowly, reluctantly, as though it did not wish to be parted from the fabric it had claimed. Elizabeth watched the water darken and thought about Annie Chapman walking these same streets just days ago, alive and breathing, unaware that her life was measured in hours. She thought about the hands that had cut Annie's throat, the same hands that had arranged her belongings in that strange pattern at her feet. She thought about how easily she herself might have ended up in similar circumstances, how thin the line was between respectable poverty and the desperate poverty that drove women onto the midnight streets. The jacket cleaned more easily than the petticoats, the blood having penetrated less deeply into the figured fabric. Elizabeth scrubbed it carefully, mindful of the delicate pattern, using a softer brush than she would have employed on plainer cloth. Annie Chapman had cared for this jacket, had mended it repeatedly, had worn it with whatever pride she could muster. Elizabeth wanted to return it in the best condition possible, though she knew that no one would ever wear it again, that it would likely be burned or buried or disposed of in some other way that acknowledged the horror of its history. The bodice required more attention. The blood had soaked through the front entirely, creating a stiff panel of rust-brown fabric that resisted Elizabeth's best efforts. She soaked it for an hour, changed the water, soaked it again. She applied soap and scrubbed until her arms ached. She held it up to the light and examined it critically, noting the stains that remained despite her labour, the shadows that would never fully fade. A younger laundress might have despaired. Elizabeth simply accepted the limits of her craft and moved on to the next garment. The stockings came clean relatively easily, the blood having dried on the surface rather than penetrating the knitted wool. The boots she set aside for the cobbler, knowing that leather required different treatment than fabric, that the blood on them would need to be addressed by someone with different skills. The chemise, like the petticoats, bore the heaviest burden of staining, and Elizabeth worked on it for nearly 2 hours before she was satisfied that she had done all she could do. By evening, the garments hung on the line in Elizabeth's small courtyard, swaying gently in the breeze that carried the scent of the nearby brewery. The stains were still visible on some of them, faded but unmistakable, marks that would identify these clothes forever as the garments of a murdered woman. Elizabeth stood in her doorway and watched them dry and thought about Annie Chapman wearing them, walking through Whitechapel in her black-figured jacket and her brown bodice and her 2 wool petticoats, looking for someone who would pay 4p for her company. She had found someone. That was the terrible thing. She had found exactly the wrong someone, a man with a knife and a purpose that no sane mind could comprehend. And now her clothes hung on Elizabeth Stride's washing line, and her body lay in the mortuary, and somewhere in the fog-shrouded streets of the East End, the man who had killed her was walking free. Elizabeth took the clothes down after dark, folding them by candlelight, wrapping them in brown paper for return to the authorities. She did not know what would become of them. She did not want to know. Her part in Annie Chapman's story was finished now, her hands having touched what remained of a woman whose name would be remembered long after Elizabeth's own name had been forgotten. She was simply the laundress. She was simply the woman who washed the blood away. The payment arrived the following day, a few shillings delivered by the same constable who had brought the bundle. Elizabeth counted the coins and put them in her cash box and tried not to think about what she had earned them for. There was other work waiting, ordinary work, the sheets and shirts and stockings of the living. She heated her water and began again, as she always did, as she always would, until her own hands grew too weak to hold the scrubbing brush. But she kept one thing from Annie Chapman's bundle, though she never told anyone and never entirely understood why. It was a small piece of fabric, torn from the hem of the lower petticoat, a scrap no larger than her palm. She tucked it into a drawer in her bedroom and left it there, a memorial to a woman she had barely known. A reminder of the day she'd washed Dark Annie's petticoat and learned exactly how much blood a human body could hold. The scrap remained in that drawer for 23 years, until Elizabeth Stride's own death in 1911. Her daughter found it when clearing out the room and did not know what it was. She threw it away with the other odds and ends that accumulate in an old woman's drawers, the buttons and ribbons and scraps of fabric that seem meaningful to their owners and meaningless to everyone else. But for 23 years it had been there. A piece of Annie Chapman's petticoat, washed clean of blood but never clean of memory, hidden in a drawer in Brick Lane while the world moved on and the killer was never caught, and the laundresses of Whitechapel continued their endless work. Chapter 4. The Economy of Blood. The commercial life of Whitechapel in the autumn of 1888 flowed through channels that respectable London preferred not to acknowledge. There was the official economy, the one recorded in ledgers and taxed by the Crown, the shops and factories and market stalls that provided employment for those fortunate enough to secure it. And then there was the shadow economy, the vast informal network of trades and services that kept the poor alive when the official economy failed them. The laundresses occupied a peculiar position between these two worlds, their work essential to both yet fully recognised by neither. A laundress in Whitechapel might operate in any of several ways, depending on her circumstances and her ambition. The most fortunate worked in established commercial laundries, large operations with multiple employees, and contracts with hotels, hospitals, and shipping companies. These women enjoyed regular wages and something approaching job security, though the work remained brutal and the pay remained poor. The less fortunate operated independent wash houses, small establishments that might serve a few dozen regular customers and relied heavily on passing trade. The least fortunate worked from their own lodgings, taking in whatever bundles they could secure, competing with dozens of other women for the same limited pool of dirty clothes. The economics of the trade were merciless. A laundress working independently might charge 3p per shirt, 4p for a dress, 6p for a full set of bed linens. From these fees she had to subtract the cost of soap, which ran to perhaps £1 per week for a busy washerwoman. She had to subtract the cost of fuel, another shilling or more depending on the season and the availability of coal. She had to subtract the cost of replacing her equipment, the wash tubs and washboards and mangles that wore out with depressing regularity. She had to subtract the cost of rent if she operated from premises separate from her lodgings. What remained, after all these subtractions, was her profit, and it was rarely enough. The arrival of the Ripper murders disrupted this precarious economy in ways that were both predictable and strange. The predictable disruption came from fear. Women who had previously walked the streets freely now hurried home before dark, and those who had operated their washhouses late into the evening found their customers unwilling to venture out to collect their cleaned garments. Trade fell off throughout Whitechapel in the weeks following the first murders, as fear kept people indoors and money grew tighter than ever. But the strange disruption came from a source that no one had anticipated. The murders created a market. It began with the newspapers. The editors of the London dailies quickly discovered that stories about the Whitechapel murders sold papers in unprecedented quantities. Every detail of the crimes was devoured by a public hungry for horror, and the newspapers competed fiercely to provide the most lurid and comprehensive coverage. Reporters swarmed through the East End, interviewing anyone who would speak to them, paying for information, paying even more for access to physical evidence of the crimes. The laundresses discovered that their knowledge had value. A woman who had washed the clothes of a victim could sell her story to the newspapers for a sum that might equal a week's normal earnings. A woman who could describe the stains in detail, who could speak with authority about the amount of blood and its distribution across the garments, commanded an even higher price. The reporters did not care about the truth so much as they cared about sensation, and the laundresses learned quickly to provide what was wanted. Some of them lied. This must be acknowledged in any honest account of the period. Some women who had never touched a victim's garment claimed to have washed them, inventing details that matched the newspaper accounts and selling their fabricated stories to credulous journalists. The newspapers rarely checked their sources, and the public rarely questioned what they read. A laundress who claimed to have washed Mary Ann Nichols' petticoat might find herself quoted in 3 or 4 different papers, her invented details repeated and embellished until they bore no resemblance to the original events. But many of them told the truth, or as much of the truth as they understood. Martha Coley, who had actually washed Mary Ann Nichols' clothes, spoke to a reporter from a penny paper in mid-September. She described the stains as she remembered them, the concentration of blood around the collar and bodice, the saturated petticoats, the smell that had lingered in her washhouse for days afterward. The reporter wrote it all down and paid her 3 shillings, more than she would have earned for washing the clothes themselves. Martha felt uneasy about accepting the money, though she could not have said exactly why. Elizabeth Stride, who had washed Annie Chapman's garments, refused to speak to the press at all. She had no objection to money, but she had a strong objection to turning a dead woman's suffering into entertainment for strangers. She told the reporters who came to her door that she had nothing to say, and she closed the door firmly in their faces, and she went back to her work as though nothing had happened. Her silence cost her income she badly needed, but she had her principles, and she would not sell them for 3 shillings or 30. The economy of blood extended beyond the newspapers. Souvenir hunters descended on Whitechapel, seeking mementos of the murders, willing to pay substantial sums for objects connected to the crimes. Fragments of fabric allegedly torn from the victim's clothing appeared for sale in the public houses, most of them obvious frauds, scraps of ordinary cloth stained with pig's blood from the slaughterhouses. Buttons supposedly from Annie Chapman's jacket changed hands for prices that would have fed a family for a week. The lodging house at 29 Hanbury Street charged admission to view the yard where she had died, until the police put a stop to the practice. Some laundresses participated in this grim commerce. A woman who had washed a victim's clothes might keep a small scrap of fabric, as Elizabeth Stride had done with Annie Chapman's petticoat, and then discover that the scrap had monetary value far exceeding its worth as cloth. The temptation to sell was considerable, and some women yielded to it. Others, like Elizabeth, kept their mementos private, regarding them as something too sacred or too terrible to be converted into coin. The regular customers of the Whitechapel washhouses found their own routines disrupted by the murders. A man bringing his shirts to be washed might find the laundress distracted, her attention focused on the newspapers rather than on his collars. A woman collecting her cleaned bedding might have to wait while the laundress finished telling a reporter about the bloodstains she had scrubbed the previous week. The murders had invaded every aspect of daily life in the East End, and the laundresses, positioned as they were at the intersection of so many domestic economies, felt the invasion more keenly than most. The police, too, discovered the value of the laundresses' knowledge. Detectives began visiting the washhouses, asking questions about any unusual garments that had arrived for cleaning, any blood-stained clothing that might indicate involvement in the crimes. The laundresses answered as best they could, though their answers rarely proved useful. Blood was simply too common in Whitechapel to serve as meaningful evidence. Every slaughterhouse worker, every butcher, every midwife brought blood-stained clothing to the wash. The killer, if he were clever, could hide his evidence among 1,000 similar bundles and never be detected. Some laundresses reported suspicious customers to the police anyway, hoping for rewards that never materialized, or simply trying to do their civic duty. Others kept their suspicions to themselves, unwilling to bring the attention of the authorities down upon their neighbours. The East End had a complicated relationship with the Metropolitan Police, a mixture of dependence and distrust that made cooperation difficult, even when cooperation might have saved lives. A laundress who reported a neighbour to the police might find herself shunned by the community, branded as an informer, cut off from the network of mutual support that made survival possible in such desperate circumstances. The autumn wore on, and the killings continued, and the economy of blood grew more elaborate. Newspapers offered bounties for information leading to the killer's capture. Private citizens posted rewards. Amateur detectives flooded into Whitechapel, convinced that they could succeed where the professionals had failed. Through it all, the laundresses continued their work, washing the ordinary clothes of ordinary people, occasionally washing something far more terrible, carrying knowledge in their cracked and bleeding hands that they could neither sell nor surrender. The price of soap rose slightly in October, as suppliers recognised the increased demand from washhouses working overtime to process the evidence of the crimes. The price of coal rose too, as it always did when autumn turned toward winter. The laundresses adjusted their prices accordingly, adding a farthing here and a halfpenny there, and their customers grumbled but paid because clean clothes were a necessity, and the alternative was to go without. Money flowed through Whitechapel in strange channels that autumn. Reporters paid laundresses for stories. Souvenir hunters paid for fragments of fabric. The police paid for information that rarely proved useful. The lodging houses charged admission to view the murder sites. The newspapers sold record numbers of copies. And somewhere in the midst of all this commerce, the killer walked free, spending whatever money he possessed in whatever way he chose, perhaps even bringing his own blood-stained clothing to a wash-house, where a woman would scrub it clean without ever knowing whose blood she was washing away. It was possible. The laundresses thought about it late at night, when the work was done and the candles burned low. It was possible that they had already touched the killer's clothes, had already plunged their hands into water reddened by his crimes, had already returned his garments to him clean and pressed, and ready to be worn again. They had no way of knowing. They would never know. The blood of the victims and the blood of the killer might have mingled in the same basins, indistinguishable, anonymous, washed away into the gutters and the drains and the dark Thames that carried all of London's secrets to the sea. The economy of blood asked no questions about the source of its currency. It simply flowed, like the blood itself, through channels that respectable society preferred not to see, touching hands that respectable society preferred not to acknowledge, sustaining lives that respectable society preferred to forget, and the laundresses worked on, because the work never stopped, because there was always another bundle waiting, because the economy of blood had made their labour more valuable than ever, even as it made their knowledge more terrible than they had ever imagined it could be. Chapter 5. The Double Event. The last night of September came to Whitechapel wrapped in fog so thick that the gas lamps seemed to float disembodied in the darkness, pale yellow ghosts that illuminated nothing beyond their own small spheres of light. The air tasted of coal smoke and river damp, and the cobblestones were slick with moisture that had condensed from the heavy atmosphere. It was a night for staying indoors, for bolting doors and drawing curtains, for huddling close to whatever meagre fire one could afford. It was a night when the shadows seemed deeper than usual, when every sound from the street below carried an edge of menace. In the early hours of the morning, while most of Whitechapel slept its uneasy sleep, 2 women died within the space of a single hour. The first was Elizabeth Stride, called Long Liz, a Swedish woman of 45 who had lived in London for more than 2 decades. She was found in Dutfield's yard off Burner Street, her throat cut but her body otherwise unmolested. The police theorised that the killer had been interrupted before he could complete his work, frightened away by the approach of a pony and cart whose driver had stumbled upon the scene. Elizabeth Stride's blood was still warm when the police arrived. Her killer might have been only moments gone, vanishing into the fog that swallowed all evidence of his passage. The second was Catherine Eddowes, called Kate, a woman of 46 who had been released from Bishopsgate Police Station only an hour before her death. She had been detained for drunkenness earlier that evening, a common enough occurrence in the East End, and had given a false name when questioned by the sergeant. She was found in Mitre Square, within the boundaries of the City of London rather than Whitechapel proper, her throat cut, her body mutilated in ways that exceeded even the horrors visited upon Annie Chapman. The killer had taken his time with Catherine Eddowes. He had not been interrupted. The newspapers called it the double event, a phrase that captured the theatrical quality of the night's horrors while somehow diminishing their reality. 2 women had been murdered within 45 minutes and perhaps a quarter mile of each other. The killer had struck twice in a single night, had demonstrated a boldness and a ferocity that terrified even those who had grown accustomed to the steady drumbeat of Whitechapel violence. The police flooded the streets, the vigilance committees doubled their patrols, and in the wash-houses scattered throughout the East End, the laundresses waited for the bundles they knew would come. Elizabeth Stride's clothing arrived at a wash-house in Settle Street on the morning of the 1st of October. The woman who received it was named Hannah Bloom, a widow of 53 who had been taking in laundry since her husband's death from consumption 11 years before. She had heard about the murders from a neighbour who had been awakened by the commotion in the early hours, and she had known, even before the constable appeared at her door, that the night's violence would eventually find its way to her washtub. The bundle was smaller than she had expected. Elizabeth Stride had been wearing only a few garments when she died, the autumn chill not yet severe enough to require heavy layers. A black cloth jacket much worn, a black skirt with a brown velvet collar, a white chemise, a pair of stockings, a crepe bonnet. The bloodstains were concentrated around the collar and bodice, consistent with the wound to the throat, and Hannah noted with relief that the quantity of blood was less than she had feared. The interruption of the killer had spared Elizabeth Stride the mutilations that had been visited upon earlier victims. Hannah worked methodically through the garments, soaking them in cold water, scrubbing them against her washboard, applying soap to the most stubborn stains. She had washed the clothes of murder victims before, though never 2 in a single week, and she approached the task with the professional detachment that 30 years of experience had taught her. The blood was simply another stain to be removed. The woman who had worn these clothes was beyond any help that Hannah could provide. What remained was only cloth and thread, and the residue of violence, material facts that could be addressed through familiar techniques. Catherine Eddowes' clothing presented a different challenge entirely. Her garments arrived at a wash-house in Duke Street, just outside the boundary of the City of London, delivered by a constable from the city police rather than the Metropolitan Force. The laundress who received them was a woman named Sarah Simmons, a mother of 6 who had operated her small establishment for nearly 2 decades, and who prided herself on her ability to remove any stain from any fabric. Sarah's pride was tested that morning. Catherine Eddowes had been wearing multiple layers when she died, and the blood had soaked through all of them. A black straw bonnet trimmed with velvet, a black cloth jacket with imitation fur at the collar, a dark green chintz skirt, a white apron, multiple petticoats, all of it saturated with blood that had pooled and spread and penetrated, until Sarah wondered if there was any fabric left beneath the staining. The apron was the worst. A large piece had been cut from it, removed by the killer for purposes that the police could not explain. What remained was soaked in blood so thoroughly that Sarah could not determine its original colour without consulting the inventory that the constable had provided. The missing piece had been found later, discarded in a doorway in Goulston Street, and Sarah wondered why the killer had taken it, what use he had found for a fragment of a murdered woman's apron. She did not want to know the answer. She only wanted to complete her work and have the garments out of her establishment. She worked for most of the day, changing her water every half hour, watching it turn red and then brown and then a murky crimson that reminded her of the Thames at low tide. The petticoats required multiple soakings before the blood would release its grip on the fabric. The jacket proved almost impossible to clean. The imitation fur matted with dried blood that resisted soap and scrubbing alike. Sarah considered simply cutting away the affected sections, but she knew the police might want the garments preserved as evidence, and she did not want to be accused of destroying anything that might help catch the killer. By evening, both women had completed their work, hanging the garments to dry in their respective courtyards, while the fog that had covered the murders continued to blanket the city. Hannah Bloom stood in her doorway and watched Elizabeth Stride's jacket sway in the faint breeze, thinking about the woman who had worn it, wondering what her final moments had been like. Sarah Simmons did the same in Duke Street, her thoughts fixed on Catherine Eddowes and the terrible things that had been done to her before death had finally offered release. The newspapers the following day were filled with details of both murders, the double event commanding headlines across London and beyond. Reporters descended on Whitechapel in greater numbers than ever before, seeking interviews with anyone who had any connection to the victims or the crimes. Both Hannah and Sarah found journalists at their doors, offering payment for their stories, eager to hear descriptions of the bloodstains and the garments, and the experience of washing the clothes of murdered women. Hannah refused to speak. She'd seen what the newspapers had done with earlier stories, how they had sensationalized and exaggerated, and turned the suffering of real women into entertainment for readers who would never set foot in Whitechapel. She would not contribute to that spectacle. She told the reporters that she had nothing to say and closed her door firmly, and she went back to her work as though the bundles she had washed that morning had contained nothing more remarkable than soiled bed linens. Sarah, by contrast, spoke freely. She had 6 children to feed, and a husband who had been out of work for 3 months, and the money the reporters offered was more than she could earn in a week of washing. She described Catherine Eddowes' garments in detail, the layers of blood-soaked fabric, the missing piece of apron, the smell that had filled her wash-house as she worked. She described her own reactions, the horror and the pity and the determination to do her job despite the circumstances. The reporters wrote it all down and paid her 5 shillings, and her story appeared in 3 different newspapers the following day, attributed to an anonymous laundress who had washed the Ripper's latest victim. The money helped. Sarah bought coal and bread and a bit of meat for her children's supper, and she told herself that she had done nothing wrong, that the story was hers to tell if she chose to tell it. But she noticed that some of her regular customers stopped coming after the story appeared, taking their business to laundresses who had not been associated with the murders. The economy of blood extracted its own price from those who participated in it, and Sarah found that the 5 shillings she had earned were offset by the business she had lost. the fog lifted on the 3rd of October, revealing a Whitechapel that looked much the same as it had before the double event. The streets were still narrow and crowded, the lodging houses were still full, the slaughterhouses still sent their workers home with blood on their aprons. But something had changed in the atmosphere of the district, a tension that had not been present before, a sense of waiting for the next horror to arrive. The laundresses felt it most keenly. They had become, without asking for the role, witnesses to history. Their hands had touched the garments of women whose names would be remembered for generations, had washed away blood that had been spilled by a killer whose identity remained unknown. They carried knowledge that no one else possessed, intimate knowledge of the stains and the smells and the weight of sodden fabric heavy with death. And they understood, in ways that the newspaper readers and the amateur detectives could not understand, that the killer was not a monster from a penny dreadful, but a man who walked the same streets they did, who perhaps brought his own laundry to a washhouse just like theirs. The thought haunted them through the long autumn nights. The killer had to wash his clothes somewhere. The blood of 4 women, 5 women, however many women eventually fell beneath his blade, had to be cleaned from his garments before he could return to whatever life he led when he was not hunting in the fog. He might be a customer at any washhouse in Whitechapel. He might have already passed his blood-stained clothing to a laundress who had scrubbed it clean without ever knowing what she was washing away. It was possible. It was more than possible. It was almost certain that someone, somewhere, had washed the Ripper's clothes, and that someone would never know, could never know, unless the killer was caught and his laundress identified and brought forward to testify about the stains she had removed. The police did not investigate this angle, or if they did, their investigation left no record. The laundresses were invisible to the official inquiry, their knowledge unvalued, their testimony unsought. They were simply working women, beneath the notice of the detectives and the coroners and the journalists who filled column after column with speculation about the killer's identity. No one thought to ask them what they knew. No one thought they might know anything worth asking. And so the knowledge remained locked in their cracked and bleeding hands, in their memories of blood-darkened water and the smell of copper and the weight of garments heavy with death. The double event had doubled their burden. The fog had lifted, but the darkness remained. The Chapter 6, The Hands That Knew. In the hierarchy of evidence that the Victorian legal system recognised, the testimony of a laundress ranked somewhere below that of a servant, and considerably below that of any man of property. The coroners who presided over the inquests into the Whitechapel murders called witnesses of all sorts, police constables and physicians and neighbours and lodging-house keepers, but they did not call the women who had washed the victims' clothing. The bloodstains that might have told a story were scrubbed away before anyone thought to ask what they revealed. This oversight was not malicious. It was simply the product of a society that did not recognise working-class women as possessors of knowledge worth hearing. The laundresses knew things that no one else knew, had observed evidence that no one else had examined, but their observations went unrecorded and their knowledge went unused. They were functionaries, not witnesses. Their hands were instruments of cleanliness, not investigation. Yet the hands knew things. The hands of every laundress who had touched the garments of the Ripper's victims carried information that the police surgeon's scalpel could not provide. They had felt the weight of blood-soaked fabric, had measured through touch the quantity of blood that had been spilled. They had traced the patterns of staining, noting where the blood was thickest and where it was merely splashed. They had observed the cuts in the fabric, the tears that corresponded to wounds in the flesh beneath. They had handled evidence that passed through their wash-houses on its way to being destroyed, and they had destroyed it themselves, following the instructions of the police who wanted the clothes cleaned for return to the victims' families. Martha Coley, who had washed Mary Ann Nichols' garments, noticed that the blood was concentrated around the collar and bodice, in a pattern consistent with a throat wound. The staining extended downward in streaks, suggesting that the blood had flowed while the victim was lying on her back. There was additional staining on the lower portion of the dress and the petticoats, but it was different in character, smeared rather than pooled, suggesting that it had come from wounds inflicted after the throat had been cut. Martha did not share these observations with anyone. She was not asked to share them. She simply noted them to herself as she worked, and then put them out of her mind as best she could. Elizabeth Stride, who had washed Annie Chapman's clothes, observed that the bloodstains told a more complex story. The concentration around the collar was similar to what Martha had described, consistent with a throat wound as the primary cause of death, but the staining on the lower garments was more extensive and more varied, suggesting multiple wounds to the lower body. The tears in the fabric corresponded to incisions rather than to any natural wear, clean cuts that had clearly been made with a sharp blade. Elizabeth understood, without anyone telling her, that Annie Chapman had been mutilated after death in ways that the newspapers only hinted at. She kept this understanding to herself. Hannah Bloom, who had washed Elizabeth Stride's garments after the double event, noted that the blood was almost entirely confined to the throat area. The staining was heavy but localized, suggesting a single deep wound that had killed quickly. There was little blood on the lower garments, almost none on the petticoats. Hannah concluded that Elizabeth Stride had not been mutilated, that the killer had been interrupted before he could complete whatever ritual he intended to perform. This conclusion matched what the newspapers had reported, but Hannah had reached it independently through her examination of the stains alone. Sarah Simmons, who had washed Catherine Eddowes' garments, faced the most disturbing evidence of all. The bloodstains covered almost every inch of the clothing, soaking through layer after layer of fabric in patterns that spoke of violence beyond anything the other laundresses had witnessed. The cuts in the fabric were numerous and varied, corresponding to wounds that Sarah could not bear to imagine. The missing piece of apron haunted her, the clean edge where the killer's blade had sliced through the cloth, removing a section for purposes that remained mysterious. Sarah worked through Catherine Eddowes' garments in a state of controlled horror, her hands performing familiar motions while her mind recoiled from what those motions revealed. None of these women were asked to testify at the inquests. None of them were interviewed by the detectives investigating the crimes. Their knowledge, accumulated through years of experience with blood-stained garments, was never incorporated into the official record of the Whitechapel murders. The coroners heard from physicians who had examined the bodies, from police surgeons who had documented the wounds, from witnesses who had seen the victims alive and witnesses who had discovered them dead. They did not hear from the laundresses who had touched the final garments of the murdered women, who had traced with their own fingers the patterns of blood that told the story of how those women had died. The hands knew other things as well. They knew the victims as individuals, as women who had lived and worked and struggled in the same streets where the laundresses themselves lived and worked and struggled. Martha Coley had seen Mary Ann Nichols at the water pump in Flower and Dean Street, had exchanged nods of recognition with a woman whose face she knew, but whose name she had not learned until after her death. Elizabeth Stride had washed Annie Chapman's clothes before, had known her as a customer, had spoken with her about the price of soap and the difficulty of finding reliable work in an economy that offered so few options to women of their circumstances. This personal knowledge gave depth to the physical evidence that passed through their hands. The laundresses did not see the victims as mere bodies, as subjects for clinical examination or newspaper speculation. They saw them as women like themselves, women who had worn these same garments through days of ordinary life before those garments became evidence of extraordinary violence. They mourned them in ways that the coroners and the detectives could not, in ways that the newspaper readers would never understand. They mourned them as sisters, as neighbours, as fellow travellers through the harsh landscape of East End poverty. The hands remembered what the mouths could never say. Years later, decades later, the women who had washed the Ripper's victims' clothing would find themselves unable to articulate what they had experienced. The words did not exist for the weight of blood-soaked fabric, for the smell of copper and death. for the particular texture of cloth that had been cut by a murderer's blade. They could describe the facts, the colours and quantities and locations of stains, but they could not convey the emotional reality of touching evidence of such violence, of plunging their hands into water reddened by blood that should never have been spilled. Some of them tried, in later years, to share their memories with family members or with historians who sought to document the experiences of ordinary people during extraordinary times. Their testimonies, where they survive at all, are fragmentary and imprecise, coloured by decades of remembering and forgetting and reshaping. They remembered that the work had been terrible. They remembered that they had carried knowledge that no one else wanted to hear. They remembered that their hands had touched history and that history had left its mark upon them. The official record of the Whitechapel murders makes no mention of the laundresses. The case files, such as they survive, contain reports from police surgeons and detectives, from witnesses and suspects and persons of interest. They contain inventories of the victims' clothing, lists of garments and their condition when found. They do not contain any record of what happened to those garments after the physicians had finished their examinations, after the coroners had completed their inquests, after the bodies had been buried and the clothing had been sent away to be cleaned. The silence speaks to the invisibility of working-class women in Victorian society, to the assumption that their labour and their knowledge were beneath official notice. The laundresses existed at the intersection of public horror and private grief, handling evidence that the public consumed as sensation, while the families of the victims mourned their loss. They bridged the gap between the clinical world of the mortuary and the intimate world of daily life, returning cleaned garments to lodging houses where the beds of the murdered women would soon be occupied by others equally desperate, equally vulnerable. Their hands knew things that the official record does not preserve. Their hands knew the weight of the dead, the texture of violence, the particular heaviness of fabric soaked with blood. Their hands knew the victims as women, as customers, as neighbours, and their hands kept working, long after the murders had stopped, long after the killer had vanished into whatever obscurity claimed him, long after Whitechapel had learned to live with its terrible fame. The hands knew, the hands remembered, and the hands eventually grew still, as all hands must, taking their knowledge with them into graves that bear no markers and leave no records for historians to find. Chapter 7. The Fog and the Lie. October settled over Whitechapel like a damp grey blanket, the days growing shorter and the fogs growing thicker as autumn deepened toward winter. The laundresses felt the change in their bones, in the ache of joints that had spent too many years immersed in water, in the cough that never quite cleared between one cold and the next. The work grew harder as the light diminished, and the candles they burned to see their scrubbing ate into profits that were already too thin to sustain them. The rhythm of the washhouse continued despite the murders, or perhaps because of them. The living still needed their clothes cleaned, still brought their bundles to the familiar establishments where they had always brought them, still expected their garments returned on time and in acceptable condition. The laundresses could not afford to dwell on the horrors that had passed through their hands. They had work to do, endless work, and the work would not wait for them to recover from whatever terrors the previous weeks had delivered. A day in the life of a Whitechapel laundress in October of 1888 began before dawn, as it always had, with the lighting of the fire and the heating of the water. The process took longer now that the weather had turned cold, the fuel refusing to catch, the water requiring more heat to reach the proper temperature. The laundress worked in darkness for the first hour or more, feeling her way through familiar motions, waiting for the grey light of morning to creep through the small window that was her only source of natural illumination. The bundles arrived throughout the morning, carried by customers or by the runners who served the larger establishments. Each bundle had to be logged, the contents inventoried, the price agreed upon before the work could begin. A shirt, 3d, a dress, 4d, a complete set of bed linens, 6d. The prices had not changed in years, though the cost of soap and fuel had risen steadily, eating away at margins that had never been generous. The laundresses absorbed these increases as best they could, working longer hours, taking on more customers, cutting corners where corners could be cut without sacrificing quality. The sorting came next. The separation of whites from colours, of delicates from sturdy woolens, of garments requiring special treatment from those that could be processed in bulk. This was skilled work, requiring an eye trained by years of practice to recognise the particular needs of different fabrics. A mistake at this stage could ruin a garment, could cost the laundress more than she would earn from the entire day's labour. The best laundresses sorted quickly, but carefully, their hands moving through the pile with the efficiency of long experience. Then came the washing itself, the endless cycle of soaking and scrubbing and rinsing that defined the laundress's existence. The first soak loosened the surface dirt, the grime of London streets and London air that accumulated on every garment exposed to the city's atmosphere. The scrubbing removed the deeper stains, the sweat and food and blood and all the other substances that found their way onto cloth in the course of daily life. The rinsing cleared away the soap, leaving the fabric clean and ready for drying. The soap burned. It always burned, the lye eating into skin that had never been given time to heal from previous exposures. The laundresses wrapped their hands in rags when they could, though the rags quickly became sodden and provided little protection. They applied tallow to their cracked skin at night, trying to restore some measure of softness before the next day's work destroyed it again. Some of them developed infections that spread from their hands to their arms, requiring treatment from physicians they could not afford. Some of them lost fingers to gangrene, becoming unable to work, becoming burdens on families that could not support them. The physical toll was matched by the emotional weight of the work, particularly in that autumn of 1888. Every bundle that arrived might contain evidence of violence, might force the laundress to confront again the horrors that had become commonplace in Whitechapel. The blood-stained aprons from the slaughterhouses, once merely unpleasant, now carried associations with the murders that could not be shaken. The laundresses found themselves examining every stain with new attention, wondering if this blood was animal or human, wondering if this garment had been worn during the commission of a crime. The fear was pervasive and exhausting. The laundresses walked home through the same streets where the victims had been found, hurrying through the fog with their hearts racing at every shadow. They locked their doors at night and lay awake listening for sounds that might indicate danger, the creak of a footstep on the stairs, the rattle of a window being tested. They told their daughters to stay indoors after dark, knowing that the daughters would not listen, knowing that poverty drove women onto the streets regardless of the risks. Some of the laundresses knew the victims personally, and their grief added to the general atmosphere of fear and sorrow. Others knew women who had narrowly escaped, who had encountered suspicious men in the fog and had fled before anything terrible could happen. The stories circulated through the washhouses, growing more elaborate with each retelling, until it became impossible to distinguish genuine close calls from fabricated tales designed to attract attention or sympathy. The fog itself became a character in the narrative of that autumn, a malevolent presence that seemed to enable and conceal the violence that had overtaken the district. The London fog of 1888 was not mere mist, but a toxic mixture of water vapour and coal smoke, a yellow-grey shroud that burned the lungs and stung the eyes and reduced visibility to a few feet in the worst conditions. It crept into the washhouses through every crack and crevice, filling the air with moisture that made the drying of clothes almost impossible. It seeped into the lungs of women already weakened by years of breathing steam and soap fumes, breeding the consumption that killed so many of them before their time. The laundresses cursed the fog even as they understood that it was simply part of life in London, as inescapable as the poverty that defined their existence. They hung their washing on indoor lines when the outdoor air was too damp, draping the garments over every available surface until their small rooms became forests of dangling fabric. The clothes took twice as long to dry as they had in summer, throwing off schedules and delaying returns and provoking complaints from customers who did not understand or did not care about the challenges of the laundress's trade. November approached and the murders continued. The police had no suspects, or rather, they had too many suspects, an endless parade of men who had been denounced by neighbours or identified by amateur detectives, or who had simply behaved strangely enough to attract attention. The newspapers printed theories that ranged from the plausible to the absurd, blaming the murders on foreign sailors, on mad doctors, on Jewish immigrants, on anyone whose difference from respectable English society made them convenient targets for suspicion. The laundresses listened to these theories and said little. They had their own ideas about the killer, formed through their intimate knowledge of Whitechapel streets and the people who walked them. They suspected that the murderer was not a stranger but a resident, someone who knew the district well enough to navigate its maze of courts and alleys, someone who could disappear into the fog because he was already part of it. They did not share these suspicions with the police, who would not have listened anyway, who did not consider laundresses worth consulting in matters of criminal investigation. The lie continued to burn their hands. The fog continued to fill their lungs. The bundles continued to arrive, endless piles of dirty clothing that required their attention, regardless of what horrors the newspapers reported or what fears kept them awake at night. The work was their anchor, the fixed point around which the chaos of the autumn revolved. They could not control the murders. They could not catch the killer. They could only do their work day after day, scrubbing and rinsing and wringing and drying, until their bodies gave out or the economy changed or death came to claim them as it had claimed so many others. The fog lifted occasionally, revealing blue skies that seemed to belong to a different world, a world where women were not murdered in the streets and laundresses did not wash their blood from their clothing. These moments of clarity were precious and brief, and the laundresses emerged from their wash houses to feel the sun on their faces and to remember what life had been like before the autumn of 1888 had changed everything. Then the fog returned, and with it the fear, and the work continued as it always had, as it always would, until the last laundress in Whitechapel laid down her brush and closed her eyes and joined the victims whose garments she had spent her life washing clean. Chapter 8. Mary Jane's Shawl. The 9th of November dawned cold and grey over Whitechapel, the kind of morning that made the bones ache and the spirit falter. A thin rain had fallen during the night, leaving the cobblestones slick and the air heavy with the smell of wet soot. In the wash-houses throughout the district, women were already at their work, heating water and sorting garments, unaware that the day would bring news of a horror that would eclipse all that had come before. Mary Jane Kelly was 25 years old when she died, the youngest of the canonical victims by more than 2 decades. She had been born in Ireland, had lived in Wales, had spent time in a high-class establishment in the West End, before circumstances brought her to Whitechapel, and the single room she rented at 13 Miller's Court. She was known in the neighbourhood as a handsome woman, fair-haired and full-figured, with a singing voice that her neighbours remembered long after they had forgotten the details of her face. She had been drinking on the night of the 8th of November, singing Irish songs in her small room while the rain fell outside, and sometime in the early hours of the morning the killer had come for her. What was done to Mary Jane Kelly exceeded anything the Ripper had done before. The previous victims had been murdered in the street, their mutilations constrained by the fear of discovery, by the need to work quickly before someone happened upon the scene. Mary Jane Kelly was killed in the privacy of her own room, behind a locked door, with hours of darkness remaining before morning light would force the killer to flee. He had used those hours. He had used them thoroughly. The police surgeon who examined the scene would later describe what he found in clinical language that could not convey the true horror of it. The body had been mutilated beyond recognition. The face had been cut away. Organs had been removed and arranged around the room. The violence that had been unleashed in that small space defied comprehension, defied the imagination of even those who had been following the Ripper's work since the first killing in August. There was almost nothing left to wash. The woman who received what remained of Mary Jane Kelly's clothing was named Agnes Millwood. She operated a small wash-house in Dorset Street, just steps from Miller's Court, and she had known Mary Jane by sight, had exchanged greetings with her on the stairs of the lodging house where they both had business. When the constable arrived at her door with the bundle, Agnes understood immediately what it contained, and she considered for the first time in her career refusing a commission. The bundle was light, far lighter than the others had been. Mary Jane Kelly had been wearing only a linen chemise when she died, having undressed for bed or for her visitor before the violence began. The chemise was all that remained, that and a shawl that had been found draped over a chair, spared from the carnage by its distance from the bed. Agnes unwrapped the bundle slowly, her hands trembling in a way they had not trembled since her first days as a laundress decades ago. The chemise was beyond salvage. Agnes knew this the moment she saw it, the fabric so saturated with blood that it had stiffened into a board-like rigidity, the original white colour entirely obscured beneath layers of rust-brown staining. She could not determine where the fabric ended and the blood began. The two had merged into something that was neither cloth nor blood, but a new substance entirely, a material record of violence that no amount of soap or scrubbing could ever erase. She set the chemise aside and turned her attention to the shawl. It was a simple garment, wool, dyed a deep red that had faded with wear and washing. Mary Jane had worn it often, draped over her shoulders against the chill of the unheated room, and it carried the smell of her even now, the scent of cheap perfume and coal smoke and the particular odour of a woman who had lived hard and expected to die young. The blood on the shawl was minimal, a few spots near the fringe where it had hung closest to the bed, spatters that Agnes could remove with patience and care. She worked on the shawl for most of the morning, treating it with a gentleness she had not known she possessed. This was all that remained of Mary Jane Kelly's worldly possessions. This faded red shawl that had kept her warm through the autumn nights, that had been the last garment she had touched before removing it and hanging it on the chair. Agnes wanted to return it clean, wanted to give whoever might claim it something that was not entirely consumed by the horror of Mary Jane's death. The spots came out slowly, yielding to cold water and careful scrubbing. Agnes changed her water frequently, watching the faint pink tinge that indicated blood, working until the water ran clear and the wool was soft again in her hands. She hung the shawl to dry near the fire, checking it every few minutes to ensure that it was drying evenly, that no new stains were emerging from the depths of the fabric. The chemise she burned. There was nothing else to be done with it. She took it into the small yard behind her wash-house and fed it into the fire that heated her copper pot, watching the flames consume the blood-stiffened fabric, smelling the particular smell of burning blood that she would remember for the rest of her life. The fire burned hot and bright, and within minutes there was nothing left of Mary Jane Kelly's chemise but ash that scattered in the wind. Agnes stood by the fire until it burned down to embers. She thought about Mary Jane singing in her room, the Irish songs that had carried through the thin walls of Miller's Court, the voice that had been silenced forever in the early hours of the morning. She thought about the shawl drying by her own fire, the last material remnant of a woman who had been only 25 years old, who had come to London seeking a better life, and had found instead a death that would make her famous for all the wrong reasons. The police came by in the afternoon, asking questions about what Agnes had seen and heard the night before. She told them what little she knew, which was nothing of any use. She'd been asleep, as most of Whitechapel had been asleep, while Mary Jane Kelly was being murdered yards from where Agnes lay. She had heard nothing. She had seen nothing. She was simply the laundress who'd been asked to wash what remained of a murdered woman's clothing, and she had done her job as best she could. The shawl dried by evening, soft and clean, the red wool restored to something like its original appearance. Agnes folded it carefully, wrapping it in brown paper, wondering who would come to claim it. Mary Jane had family somewhere, a father in Ireland or Wales, perhaps siblings who did not know yet that their sister was dead. The shawl might find its way to them eventually, pass through the channels of official notification and personal grief, a memento of a woman they had lost to the streets of London. No one came to claim it. The days passed, and then the weeks, and the shawl remained in Agnes's washhouse, wrapped in its brown paper, waiting for an owner who would never arrive. The police had no address for Mary Jane's family. The lodging house keeper had no information to share. Mary Jane Kelly had been alone in the world in ways that went beyond her solitary death, cut off from whatever roots she had once possessed, adrift in the great city that had consumed her. Agnes kept the shawl. She told herself she was keeping it in case someone came to claim it, in case a long-lost relative appeared at her door with proof of their connection to the murdered woman. But months passed, and then years, and still the shawl remained wrapped in its brown paper, stored in a trunk in Agnes's bedroom, never worn, never displayed, never spoken of to anyone who did not already know the story. It became a kind of relic, a sacred object that connected Agnes to the horror of that November morning, and to the woman whose blood she had washed from its fringes. She would take it out sometimes, late at night when she could not sleep, and she would hold it in her hands and think about Mary Jane Kelly singing in her room, about the voice that had been silenced, about the violence that had erupted in the small space just yards from where Agnes now sat. The shawl outlived Agnes Millward by many years. When she died in 1903, her daughter found it in the trunk, still wrapped in its brown paper, still carrying the faint scent of wool and smoke and something else that the daughter could not identify. The daughter did not know the story. Agnes had never told her. She assumed it was simply an old shawl that her mother had been too sentimental to discard, and she gave it to a charity along with the other contents of the trunk. From there, the trail goes cold. Mary Jane Kelly's shawl passed out of history, lost among the countless other garments that circulated through the second-hand markets of London, worn by women who never knew whose shoulders it had once warmed, whose blood had once spotted its fringes, whose death it had witnessed from its perch on a chair in a room in Miller's Court. The laundress had done her work, the blood had been washed away, and Mary Jane Kelly's shawl continued its journey through the world, carrying its secret history in fibres that would eventually wear thin and tear and crumble to dust, as all fabric must, as all memory must, as all evidence of lives lived and lives lost must eventually fade into the silence of forgotten time. Chapter 9. The Silence. After the murder stopped after Mary Jane Kelly, no one knew why. The police did not catch the killer, did not even identify him with any certainty, though theories would multiply in the years and decades that followed until the Ripper became more myth than man, more symbol than suspect. He simply stopped, or died, or was confined to an asylum, or moved away, or transformed himself into something that could pass undetected through the streets he had terrorized. The violence ended, and Whitechapel was left to make sense of what had happened. The laundresses returned to their ordinary work. The bundles that arrived at their doors contained ordinary garments, soiled with ordinary dirt, stained with the ordinary blood of slaughterhouses and childbirth and minor accidents. The extraordinary had passed, leaving behind only memory and rumour, and the fading headlines of newspapers that had moved on to new sensations. The Ripper had given Whitechapel a kind of terrible fame, and now that fame had to be lived with, had to be incorporated into the daily routines of people who had never asked to be part of history. Martha Coley continued washing clothes in her basement establishment on Thomas Street until 1894, when a fall down the stairs left her unable to work. She had never spoken publicly about her experience washing Mary Ann Nichols' garments, had refused the reporters who came seeking her story, had kept her knowledge locked away in a part of her mind that she rarely visited. Her hands still remembered, still sometimes paused over a bloodstain as though expecting it to reveal something more than it contained, but her mouth remained closed. She died in 1897, in the same lodging house where she had spent most of her adult life, and her death merited no notice in any newspaper. Elizabeth Stride, the laundress who had washed Annie Chapman's clothes, outlived the century by more than a decade. She never discarded the scrap of fabric she had kept from Annie's petticoat, never explained to anyone why she'd kept it, never fully understood herself why it seemed important to preserve this small connection to a woman she'd barely known. She died in 1911, and her daughter threw the scrap away without knowing what it was. The last physical remnant of Annie Chapman's final garments thus vanished into the refuse heap of history, unmarked and unmourned. Hannah Bloom, who had washed Elizabeth Stride's clothing after the double event, returned to her work with a determination that some of her neighbours found unsettling. She seemed unchanged by the experience, seemed to have absorbed the horror into herself without letting it alter her routines or her demeanour. She washed clothes and collected payment and complained about the price of soap, just as she had always done. But her daughter noticed that Hannah no longer slept well, that she woke sometimes in the night gasping for breath, that she murmured names in her sleep that the daughter did not recognise. Hannah died in 1901, and the names she had murmured went unrecorded. Sarah Simmons, who had washed Catherine Eddowes' garments and had sold her story to the newspapers, found that her brief fame had cost her more than it had gained. Some customers never returned to her establishment, unwilling to have their clothes cleaned by a woman who had profited from murder. Others came specifically because of her notoriety. Curious to meet the laundress who had touched the Ripper's work, but these customers rarely became regulars. They wanted the story, not the service, and once they had heard the story, they had no reason to return. Sarah struggled through the 1890s, her business declining year by year as newer establishments with newer equipment drew away her remaining customers. She closed her wash house in 1898 and went to work for a commercial laundry in Stepney, one worker among dozens. Her individual knowledge and experience submerged in the collective anonymity of the industrial process. She never spoke of the Ripper again, not even to her children, who learned of their mother's connection to the murders only after her death in 1906. Agnes Millwood, who had washed Mary Jane Kelly's shawl and burned her chemise, carried the weight of that morning for the rest of her life. She had nightmares about the fire, about the smell of burning blood, about the face of Mary Jane Kelly that she had never actually seen, but that her imagination had constructed from the descriptions in the newspapers. She kept the shawl until she died, and even in death, she could not bring herself to tell anyone what it was or where it had come from. The silence that fell after the murders was not a peaceful silence. It was a silence of suppression, of deliberate forgetting, of a community that wanted to move on from the horrors that had defined it in the eyes of the world. The laundresses were part of this silence, their knowledge unspoken, their testimony ungiven, their experiences recorded nowhere except in the fading memories of women who were themselves fading into obscurity. Whitechapel changed in the years that followed. The worst of the slums were cleared, the lodging houses demolished, the narrow courts opened up to light and air. The Jewish immigrants who had been blamed for the murders gradually integrated into London society, their children and grandchildren moving up and out into the broader world. The district that had been synonymous with poverty and violence became merely poor, no longer the byword for horror that it had been in 1888. The laundresses changed too, though more slowly. The commercial laundries expanded, driven by technological innovations that made hand washing increasingly obsolete. The small wash houses where individual women had laboured over individual garments gave way to factories where machines did the work of dozens of human hands. The old laundresses retired or died, and the young women who might have taken their places found other employment in the factories and shops and offices that were transforming the working lives of women across London. By 1900, the laundresses who had washed the Ripper's victims' clothing were already relics of an earlier age, their skills and their knowledge belonging to a world that was rapidly disappearing. They had carried the weight of history in their cracked and bleeding hands, had touched evidence that might have revealed the killer's identity, had possessed knowledge that no one had thought to ask them to share. Now they were simply old women, visible to a society that had always found them invisible, waiting for death to claim them as it had claimed the women whose garments they had washed. The silence deepened as the years passed. The laundresses who had touched the Ripper's work died one by one, taking their memories with them. Their children and grandchildren knew little of what they had experienced, had heard only fragments of stories that seemed increasingly remote from the world they themselves inhabited. The connection between the living and the dead, between the present and that terrible autumn of 1888, grew thinner with each passing year. By the time the First World War swept away the last remnants of Victorian London, the laundresses were gone. Their wash-houses had been demolished or converted to other uses. Their washtubs and washboards had been discarded or sold for scrap. Their hands, which had touched so much and known so much, had crumbled to dust in graves that bore no special markers, that gave no indication of the role their occupants had played in one of history's most infamous series of crimes. The silence was complete. The laundresses had done their work, had washed the blood away, had returned the garments clean and pressed. They had fulfilled their function in the economy of blood, and then they had disappeared, leaving behind no testimony, no record, no evidence of their existence except for a few scattered references and documents that historians would only begin to examine decades later. They had been the hands that knew. Now the hands were still, and what they had known was lost forever. Chapter 10. The Water Remembers. The Thames flows through London as it has always flowed, dark and patient, carrying the accumulated refuse of centuries toward the distant sea. In the autumn of 1888, it carried away the water from 1,000 wash-houses, water that had been reddened with blood, and then poured into gutters and drains that fed eventually into the great river. The blood of the Ripper's victims mingled there with the blood of cattle and pigs, with the effluent of tanneries and dye-works, with all the other fluids that the city generated in the course of its daily existence. The river received it all without judgment, without memory, without any record of what had passed into its depths. But water remembers in its own way. The molecules that carried the blood of Mary Ann Nichols and Annie Chapman and Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes and Mary Jane Kelly did not disappear. They dispersed, diluted beyond any possibility of detection, but they remained part of the great cycle of water that connects all living things. They evaporated and fell as rain. They were drawn up by the roots of trees and transpired through leaves. They were drunk by animals and humans and returned to the earth through 1,000 different channels. The blood that the laundresses had washed from the victims' garments became part of the world itself, inseparable from the water that sustains all life. The laundresses understood this in their way. They knew that the blood they washed away did not simply vanish, that it went somewhere, that it became part of something larger than the individual bodies from which it had been spilled. They did not have the scientific vocabulary to describe this process, but they felt its truth in their hands as they worked, felt the way the blood released into the water and the water carried it away, and the cycle continued as it had always continued, connecting the living and the dead in an endless loop of fluid and flesh. The wash-houses are gone now. The last of them closed decades ago, replaced by washing machines and laundromats and commercial services that process clothing without human hands ever touching the fabric. The skills that the Victorian laundresses possessed have been lost, the knowledge of how to remove particular stains from particular fabrics, the techniques passed down through generations of women who learned from their mothers and taught their daughters. The hands that knew have been replaced by machines that know nothing, that process all fabrics alike, that have no memory of what they clean or why. But the water remembers. The Thames still flows through London, and the water that flows through it today is connected, molecule by molecule, to the water that flowed through it in 1888. The rain that falls on Whitechapel contains traces of everything that has ever been washed into the drains of that district, infinitely diluted but never entirely destroyed. The water cycle does not distinguish between the blood of the innocent and the blood of the guilty, between the water used to wash a murdered woman's petticoat and the water used to wash an ordinary shirt. It receives all contributions equally and redistributes them without prejudice. The laundresses are part of this cycle now. Their bodies have returned to the earth from which they came, have been broken down and absorbed and transformed into new forms of matter. The hands that scrubbed the bloodstains from the Ripper's victims' clothing have become part of the soil of London, have nourished the roots of trees and the bodies of worms, have been incorporated into the endless cycle of death and renewal that governs all organic matter. They have rejoined the victims whose garments they washed, have become indistinguishable from them in the great democracy of decomposition. Their stories, too, have been absorbed into something larger. The individual experiences of Martha Coley and Elizabeth Stride and Hannah Bloom and Sarah Simmons and Agnes Millward have merged into the collective story of the Whitechapel murders, a story that has been told and retold so many times that the original events have become almost mythological. The laundresses appear in this story only as shadows, unnamed and unremembered, their contributions to the historical record limited to the few scattered references that survive in documents and newspapers. But they were there. They touched the evidence. They washed the blood. They carried knowledge that no one else possessed, knowledge that might have helped identify the killer, knowledge that was never sought and never shared. They were the invisible women of Whitechapel, the workers whose labour made possible the daily life of the district, the hands that cleaned away the evidence of both ordinary existence and extraordinary violence. The water remembers them, even if history does not. Every drop of water that falls on London today carries within it the memory of what the laundresses washed away, the blood and the soap and the tears of women who worked until their hands bled, and their backs broke and their lungs filled with the consumption that killed so many of them. The water does not judge. The water does not forget. The water simply flows, as it has always flowed, carrying everything toward the sea. In Whitechapel today, the streets are quieter than they were in 1888. The lodging houses have been replaced by council flats. The slaughterhouses have moved to the outskirts of the city. The fog that once shrouded the district has been banished by clean air regulations that the Victorians could not have imagined. The world has changed, utterly and irrevocably, and the Whitechapel of the Ripper has become a place that exists only in memory and imagination. But if you walk those streets on an autumn evening, when the light is fading and the air carries a hint of moisture, you can almost see them. The women in their worn dresses, their hands cracked and bleeding, making their way home from the wash houses where they have spent another day scrubbing and rinsing and wringing. They do not speak to you. They do not see you. They are ghosts, echoes, traces left behind in a world that has moved on without them. They were the laundresses of Whitechapel. They washed the clothes of the living and the dead. They touched the evidence of history's most infamous murders and carried that knowledge in their hands for the rest of their lives. And now they're gone, their names forgotten, their stories untold, their bones mingled with the earth that receives all of us in the end. The water remembers what we forget. The water carries what we discard. And somewhere in the great cycle that connects all living things, the blood of the Ripper's victims still flows, washed clean by hands that are now dust, dispersed through a world that has forgotten the women who touched it. The candle burns low, the chamber falls silent, and history, once again, turns the page in the dark. Good night, dear listener. May your sleep be peaceful, and may your dreams carry you gently through the long hours until morning. The Bedside Historian will be here when you return, waiting with another story from the shadowed corners of the past. Until then, rest well. The night is quiet now, and the world has grown small.